On a breezy April day in 1849, I sat astride my horse on University Hill and took a long look back at Madison. The lakes were shimmering in the spring sun, and the tree-lined street stretched up to the newly completed dome of the Capitol building. I had just bid farewell to my family, and I saw my father, for the only time in my life, with tears in his eyes. I was about to embark on a perilous journey across this great land to seek my fortune in the gold fields of California. It would be 6 long years before I could return to the family in the city that I loved so dearly. With one last look across the isthmus, I pointed my horse westward and set off on my adventure. I was 17 years old. For those of you who may not recognize me with 2 good arms, my name is Lucius Fairchild. Well, my family all called me Lush. And if you're perplexed by my reference to the number of appendages, I'll humbly beg your indulgence as my story unfolds. I was born on December 27th, 1831, the 3rd child and 2nd son to Jairus Fairchild and Sally Blair. This was also my father's 30th birthday. I wish I could say this formed a bond that drew us together, but my father and I were never very close when I was young. One reason was that he was always busy with his many business ventures. Another was that I was a poor student. Not for lack of intelligence, but for lack of interest. I simply didn't like school. And this was a blow to my father because education was always a passion of his. It formed a rift between us that never really mended. Nevertheless, when I set off for California, I did so with his blessing and his backing. When I returned, I was able to repay him by investing in the Madison Watertown Railroad Company. Mostly what I did was trek across the state, trying to persuade farmers to invest in the railroad coming through their land. My older brother Cassius, whom we called Cash, oversaw the day-to-day affairs of the company. Unfortunately, this was a bad time for the country. The financial crash of 1857 had put everyone on edge about their money. I eventually came back to Madison and worked in my father's office, a situation neither of us cared for. His humiliation was complete when he was sued for non-payment of bonds on his railroad company. It was a hard time for our family, but being back in Madison did give me the chance to get involved in local politics, which was to benefit me in ways I couldn't imagine at the time. I enlisted as a private in the Governor's Guard, but just a couple of years later, a real war erupted, a war begun by traitors to the Union, and I was among the first to volunteer to fight those rebels. I enlisted as a captain in a militia company, but I resigned that post to become a lieutenant colonel in the 2nd Wisconsin Volunteer Infantry. Cash was appointed a major in the 16th Wisconsin Volunteer Infantry, and our youngest brother, Charles, took a post with the Union Navy. Cash and I soon saw action. I fought at the Second Battle of Bull Run, South Mountain, Fredericksburg, Antietam, and Chancellorsville. Cash was seriously wounded at Shiloh and had to return to Wisconsin for treatment, but he was able to rejoin Sherman's army in time for their famous march to the sea. Unfortunately, his wound never fully healed, and he died from its after effects just 3 years later. Meanwhile, the 2nd Wisconsin had become part of the famed Iron Brigade. So on the morning of July 1st, 1863, we engaged the Confederate troops at Gettysburg. My regiment captured Brigadier General James Archer, but my moment of glory was short-lived. We were ambushed on our right flank and suffered horrendous casualties. Within a few hours, 2/3 of my men were either killed or wounded. I was shot in the left arm and briefly detained by the rebels, but I was left in the custody of a Reverend Charles Schaefer. It was at his house that a field surgeon amputated my left arm at the elbow. And now you know why I made that reference to my 2 good arms. After I'd sufficiently recovered from surgery, I returned to Madison. Retiring in 1864 from military activity, I was appointed Secretary of State of Wisconsin, a position I held for 2 years. But the most important thing to happen to me during that time in my life was when I was in Washington, D.C., and I met Miss Frances Bull. I was absolutely smitten by her wit, her charm, and her beauty. She was the most dazzling woman I'd ever met, and her work as a nurse with the war wounded was admirable beyond description. How could I not fall in love with her? Following the family tradition of assigning nicknames, I immediately dubbed her Little Frank. And we were married on April 24th, 1864. We moved back to Madison, and I received a letter from an old Army friend, Tom Allen. He wrote, "How does Mrs. F. like the frog ponds?" Joking reference to our lakes. She must not have disliked them too much, because she soon gave birth to our 3 daughters, Mary, Sarah, and Carol. Frank was a wonderful mother, but she was also passionately invested in the well-being of all women. Her pursuit of a constitutional amendment for a woman's right to vote and own property was remarkable. And since I'd just been elected to my first term as governor of Wisconsin, I did everything I could to help achieve her goals. Indeed, I had the honor to preside over a convention of the women's suffrage movement in the State Assembly chamber. Even though the amendment failed to pass, Frank conducted her life, as she did everything else, with grace and determination. I did have more success with another amendment, though. This one would allow black people to vote in Wisconsin. There's a famous test case involving a man named Ezekiel Gillespie that went all the way to the state Supreme Court. Gillespie won his case, and I later appointed his lawyer, Byron Payne, to that same Supreme Court. In 1871, after 2 more terms as governor, I began a diplomatic career, first as U.S. Consul to Liverpool, England, and then as Consul General to Paris, France. My final diplomatic post carried the splendid title of Envoy Extraordinary and Minister Plenipotentiary to Spain. Mostly my duties involved attending fancy state functions, which grew very tiresome. I was relieved to be recalled after 10 long years abroad. Towards the end of my life, my beloved little Frank commissioned the famous artist John Singer Sargent to paint a full-length portrait of me. It would hang in the Wisconsin Historical Society building, a place which I'd helped to found. It's not a terribly flattering picture. Mostly what you see is my glowering face above a chest full of medals. The most prominent part of the picture is a large black space left by the empty sleeve of my military coat. But in case you're wondering what happened to the amputated limb, I'm pleased to report that the Reverend Schaefer returned it to me from Gettysburg. He wrote me a letter saying, "We succeeded in finding the buried limb in as good a state of preservation as could have been expected. What we found was placed in a tin case, well sealed, and this was put in a wooden box. I have the whole ready and will deposit it tomorrow at the express office." Now you know why I chose to appear before you today with my full complement of arms. Like the Union for which I and my brothers had fought, we were once more complete.